They were selling popcorn to rows over. The film hit its jump scare. 1,000 heads jerked, and for one slow, impossible second, Lily Hudson's small hand slipped from her mother's fingers and vanished into the dark. No screaming, no chase, just a whisper of movement, a shoe against carpet, and then nothing. For 20 years, Fayetteville whispered her name like a prayer and a curse. Tonight, in a courtroom that smelled of cheap coffee and stale fear, a man folded like an old map under the weight of a tiny voice the town had tried to bury. He didn't say much, but what he left unsaid hung heavier than any confession. People who had loved him began to ask themselves, did we miss her? Did we protect the person who stole her? This is the story of how a child vanished beside her mother in a movie theater in 2003, and how the arrest 2 decades later tore a town's past open so wide everyone inside could see the cracks. Before we dive deeper, take a second to hit subscribe and smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and keeps these stories coming your way. And I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments below. They called it a matinee, a corridor of dim screens and sticky floors. The kind of place a mother took her small child to escape the afternoon heat. It was June 14, 2003, a Sunday, bright and ordinary, when 4-year-old Lily Hudson went quiet in a theater on the north side of Fayetteville. Her mother, Maya, had fallen asleep in the back row, not because she was careless, but because she was exhausted. A single mother working double shifts to keep their trailer warm and the electricity on. Lily had been restless most of the week, clutching a plush rabbit, asking about the ocean, and if the moon forgot to finish the night. They'd come to see a family movie, the sort of story where everything ends with music. In the dark, a shadow moved against the exit light, a blur between rows. A man in a hooded sweatshirt slipped past a reclining seat, his hands steady and patient like someone practicing for a task that required both. He reached down and lifted Lily in a motion so quiet the popcorn sellers didn't notice. So careful the other patrons thought she'd simply toddled away. He stepped into the aisle, and then he was gone through the side exit, a door that led to the parking lot, to the smell of gasoline and cut grass and an old blue van idling under the sun. The theater erupted moments later. Maya woke to empty space and the hollow echo of frightened voices. Her screams sliced through the lobby. Someone called 911. For the next 12 hours, Fayetteville became a swarm. Cops with coffee-stained uniforms, reporters from regional stations, volunteers with flashlights and puppy-eyed hope, posters with Lily's smiling face, 2 dimples, hair held back by a faded barrette, were taped to telephone poles, to shop windows, to the hearts of strangers. Investigators started with the obvious: the van, the exits, the patrons. They interviewed everyone who had been in that auditorium. A messy mosaic of teenagers, retirees with crossword puzzles, and a man who said he'd left to call his wife and returned to an empty theater. They scanned the parking lot for the vehicle. They took prints from the armrests, lifted fibers from Lily's seat, checked the security footage, only to discover the theater's cameras had been pointing at the concession stand, not the exits. Chance had been cruel and precise. Suspects flared and fizzled in the days that followed. There was an argument about a bearded man who'd been sitting near the back. He was cleared after a neighbor gave him a solid alibi. Tales of a suspicious truck idled in the rumor mill. Every neighbor with a grudge found a face to give the crime. In small towns, fear breeds urgency and accusation in equal measure. Names were whispered at bus stops, at church suppers, painted with suspicion onto anyone who shied from the public gaze. Everyone wanted an answer, and in wanting the town blurred into something else, expectant, ready to indict anyone who'd make the headline stop. The case slowed. Evidence is a patient thing. It takes time, and time was something that crawled away from Fayetteville that summer. The police did what they could with what they had. They preserved the theater seat, cataloged witness statements, took DNA samples from everyone still willing to speak. They built a file that grew fat with hearsay and thin on physical answers. Lily's face lived on milk cartons and microwaved TV segments. Her mother, sleep fractured into tiny pieces, answered questions 1,000 times and told the story over and over until the edges blurred. Years compiled into decades. The town learned to live around the absence. People still said Lily's name at memorials. A bench at the park bore a brass plate with her smiling photograph. The theater closed and reopened under a different name. Maya kept working, kept visiting the places her daughter had loved, kept lighting candles on birthdays. She aged into a woman with a small, hard line at the edge of her mouth that was never there before. The file never stayed closed. Evidence sleeps for a long time, but it does not fade. There were traces, a smudge on a sleeve, fibers caught in the threads of Lily's plush rabbit. They were small things, almost trivial except for the one law that has never failed investigators. Science moves forward, and with it, the ability to hear what silence has long kept secret. In 2022, a cold case unit reopened the file quietly, with new tools and a different patience. Forensic genealogy had matured into something resembling magic and something resembling a scalpel. By combining DNA markers with family trees built from public records and social networks, detectives could see connections no single print could reveal. The breakthrough began with DNA from an odd place, a stowaway fiber on the rabbit that had been saved in evidence. It didn't match anything in the local database, but a partial profile did hint at relatives. Months of building friendship trees, of mapping surnames across small towns and larger cities, led them at last to a name, Ethan Mercer, someone who had lived in Fayetteville at the time and whose extended family had deep roots in the surrounding counties. Ethan was not a stranger to the town. He was the kind of man who had been at barbecues and at the back of church potlucks, a smile like an old coin. He ran a small hardware store for years, a place where men leaned and traded tools and stories. He'd fixed leaky sinks and lent trailers for high school moving days. Parents trusted him with their children's bicycles. That trust is what made the discovery so explosive. When detectives knocked on Ethan's door in late 2023, the man who answered looked older than the pictures the family had kept. Miles of ordinary living had lined his face. He answered questions calmly, as though he were an actor in a role he'd been prepared to play. His housekeeper told reporters later that the first time she'd seen the police was the morning they came. Ethan told them he hadn't been in Fayetteville the day Lily vanished. He said he'd been fishing with his brother, a story corroborated by a call log and a faded Polaroid of two men by a river. The detectives had rehearsed for denials. They had practiced for the practiced innocence that sometimes hides guilt. But the partial DNA matched not just Ethan. It matched someone in his immediate genetic branch, a niece, a distant cousin. The tree tightened. Investigators found irregularities, purchase records that placed Ethan's van near the theater, a faded receipt for children's popcorn, scratch marks on the side door of his van. The hardware store had sold knee pads and gloves that matched fibers found entwined with the rabbit's fur. None of this by itself would have been a courthouse revelation, but together, with the weight of an algorithmic tie and Ethan's proximity to the place of the crime, it was enough to bring him in. Their arrest hit Fayetteville like lightning. The man who had fixed backyard fences, who had taught a Little League team how to swing, was handcuffed in front of the hardware store's display window where kids still leaned to look at new bikes. People gathered, not to see justice served, but to watch the world tilt on an axis they'd mistaken for solid. Some were in tears. Others shouted. Someone had painted monster on the asphalt, and a pastor tried to hush the crowd into prayer. Ethan's arraignment was a study in restraint. He spoke into the microphone with a voice that was soft and, at times, oddly precise. He denied taking Lily. He denied being at the theater. He called the evidence circumstantial and accused investigators of assembling a narrative around him because it was convenient. A defense attorney, young, polished, with a kind of optimism that feeds on doubt, argued the DNA evidence was a mosaic built on thin tiles. The prosecution unfurled the genealogy map like a kind of cruel tapestry. Lineage, geography, opportunity, fiber matches. For jurors who had watched the town swallow its doubts for 20 years, the choice formed not only in the evidence, but in memory, in the specific ache of a mother's unclosing grief. The trial became the town's weather. Reporters camped outside the courthouse. Social media, then in its more bruising infancy, magnified every rumor that Ethan had a secret life, that he had been seen in other towns, that he'd paid hush money. Conspiracy blogs printed speculative timelines. Neighbors who had once greeted Ethan with waves now spoke in the brittle voice of people who felt tricked. Inside the courtroom, witnesses took the stand with trembling courage. An elderly projectionist, who'd been working the projector door on the day Lily vanished, spoke of a van idling and a man moving with a purpose. A teenage boy who'd been there the day testified that he'd seen a man carry a child out to a van, but when asked to identify Ethan, his voice wavered. Memory is an unreliable witness to trauma. The most painful testimony came from Maya Hudson herself. She described plainly and with a voice that did not fracture the way Lily's hand had slipped and how the world had folded inward around that small movement. Every juror, every person in the room, felt the room contract with her story. There were confessions too, the kind that come not from the murderer, but from those who carry the shame of silence. A woman who at the time had been a cashier at the mall admitted she'd seen a blue van pull up and had told herself not to get involved because she feared being late for work. A man confessed to having seen Ethan's truck in the parking lot days after the abduction and not saying anything because he feared implicating a friend. Those confessions did not absolve the town. They showed how ordinary caution creates the room where crimes hide. Each "I should have" became another shard digging into people's conscience. Ethan's defense called character witnesses, high school coaches, church elders, customers who spoke of his generosity. They painted a man with a soft heart for hard work. The prosecution painted the same man as cunning in his ordinariness, a description that somehow felt more damning, that someone who performed kindness publicly could conceal violence privately. The courtroom scenes read like a study in human ambivalence. Jurors sat between two truths, that people are capable of both small mercies and terrible harms, and were asked to decide which outweighed which in one man's life. Then came the piece that shifted the scales. A phone record placed Ethan's call in the vicinity of the theater less than an hour after Lily vanished. A gas pump CCTV, grainy, upright, the kind of proof once dismissed as trivial, showed Ethan's van arriving and leaving with the timestamp that fit the prosecution's theory. Skepticism remained, but jurors do not live in the world of never. They live in the world of probable. On day 20 of the trial, an eyewitness stepped forward in a way that set the reporters' pens racing. A young man, now 30, who had kept quiet for 20 years, testified that he had been an occupant of the blue van that day, a detail he'd never shared because he'd been high on the day and ashamed to come forward. He said the van had stopped, the man in the hood had come in and then left with a child in his arms. He described, with a voice that was both apologetic and relieved, how he'd driven away and later burned his clothes because panic felt easier than truth. His confession put Ethan in the van in the prosecution's narrative in a way forensic fibers alone could not. Ethan's eyes did not move when the witness spoke. They seemed fixed on some small private point somewhere behind the jurors and the flags and the echoing fans. When the defense cross-examined, they hammered at inconsistencies, at the witness's drug use at the time, at the years he waited. But the damage was done. A man who had shared a ride with someone matching the description was testimony that folded around the rest of the evidence like secondhand. The jury deliberated for 3 days, which felt like a mercy to some and an eternity to others. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. Guilty. The word landed with a dull thud. Ethan Mercer was convicted on charges of kidnapping and murder. He was taken away in silence. His shoulders hunched as the clicking of cameras became the new background music of the town. But conviction did not bring closure. In the weeks after the verdict, Fayetteville found itself in the strange aftermath that follows public unmasking. Old friendships frayed, and some pretended nothing had changed. People questioned whether they'd been too quick to trust or too slow to act. The hardware store closed its doors for a time. Graffiti marred the windows. The pastor who had stood by Ethan's family during the trial resigned, saying later that he had lost his center. Families separated themselves on front porches. Teenagers who'd known Ethan as a mentor refused to speak. A neighbor left a bouquet on Maya's doorstep and signed it with forgiveness in shaky handwriting, a gesture the woman took with the guardedness of someone who does not know how to carry peace. Maya, for her part, said very little publicly. In private, she broke in ways the cameras could not capture. Shut doors, a photograph of Lily she'd never stopped touching, a voicemail message left on a phone that still had Lily's last recorded giggle. She attended the trial like someone watching a stage play she'd wanted to change. When asked by a local reporter if she felt justice, she said in a voice that did not want to be fragile, "I feel like someone answered the question. I don't feel like I have my daughter back." There were people who doubted the verdict. They said the science was a new craft and that guilt by generation was a dangerous path. They pointed to the imperfect human system that had convicted a man perhaps because he was the easiest fit. Protesters organized, legal appeals were filed. The defense claimed the prosecution had built a story from circumstantial threads stitched by the newness of genealogical tracing. The public split again. Some saw the fairness of a legal system that had, at last, reached an answer. Others feared an innocent life had been crushed under the machinery of a hungry system. Then came something no one had expected. Before the appeal process ran its long course, Ethan asked for a private meeting with Maya Hudson. He requested it through his lawyer with a letter that said simply he wanted to speak, not to absolve himself, not to recount the day, but to tell her something he could not say in public. The request lit up small phone screens and big tempers. Some called it manipulation. Others called it courage. Maya agreed. They met in a room in the courthouse under the banal fluorescent lights, with a table between them and a bottle of water sweating in the center. Ethan sat small and precise. Maya sat like someone who had been waiting a long time to look at a ghost and demand an account. For an hour they traded words that were not and could never be evidence. Ethan did not admit taking Lily. He did not speak of motive. Instead he said this: "If I had done it, I'd tell you where she is. I can't tell you that because I didn't take her. But I carry a thing that keeps me awake. I carried someone that night, and I kept my mouth shut. If I'd told, maybe..." His voice trembled on the last syllable, and then steadied. "I know I'm guilty of hiding, and that hides me in the same dark." Maya listened. It was not the absolution she'd been given by a jury. It was not the confession she'd wanted. It was, instead, a new layer on an old wound. The knowledge that the town's complicity had been more than silence about a suspect. It had been the ever-present habit of turning away. That meeting fueled headlines and hearts. It left the town in a different kind of ache. Ethan's conviction held on initial appeal, though legal battles continued for years. He served his sentence, arguing he had been scapegoated. The scars of the case did not heal cleanly. A town, once whole, forgets how not to suspect. The story took another twist 2 years on, after Ethan had been imprisoned for a time and the defense had exhausted its appeals. A small box appeared at the Hudson home. No return address. Inside lay a child's barrette, the same color as Lily's, and a single note, for words typed on an old typewriter. "I saw her that night." The note had no signature. It was a strike that reopened grief. Police treated it as a new lead. Reporters flooded the lane. Neighbors retraced their steps like consolation hunters. The note's existence whispered that there were places the file had never reached, and people who carried pieces of that night like flint in a pocket. Investigators followed up, and the handwriting led them to a woman who, at the time of the abduction, had been a temp worker at a bookshop near the theater. She testified that she had seen a figure outside the theater, and that she had scratched the undercarriage of a van to fit a bump in the curb. She gave more details: an old trailer hitch with a missing bolt, a unique lilt to the driver's laugh. Her account fit the mosaic more snugly than some had hoped. But it did not change the conviction. It only added shade. Rumor persists in small towns because it holds a space where truth refuses to be fully boxed. There are alleys of suspicion where people still point to names and old grudges. There are evenings when Maya walks by the theater, which now shows second-run films and brings in families with restless children, and she feels the press of all the maybes. She keeps Lily's photograph in a locked box and runs her fingers along the edge, like someone feeling for the shape of memory. The arrest haunted more than the man who sat behind bars. It haunted the town's sense of itself. People asked themselves if they had been kind enough, watchful enough, brave enough. Fathers questioned their casual glances. Mothers rechecked the locks on their minivans. Community leaders created programs on child safety. Volunteers formed a network to train cinema attendants to watch exits. The tragedy changed policy and routine alike. The practical outworking of sorrow converted into small protections for the future. In the courtroom's aftermath, there were new conversations about the ethics of forensic genealogy. Town meetings debated whether the new techniques should be used to sift through private family histories. People with quiet guilt said, "We could have said something." And people who feared wrongful conviction said, "We could have done more." The friction stayed, like a bruise that never quite faded. Years later, Maya sat on that same park bench where a brass plate once glinted and watched a little girl chase pigeons. The child had Lily's laugh. Maya's hands trembled and she felt both the ache and the ridiculousness of moving forward. The conviction had closed a chapter. The barrette and the note had opened another. The town had unearthed a face, and with it, 1,000 lines that led into private rooms. What remained was not neat justice or balm, but a true review of how small things, a turned head, a choice to stay silent, a donated popcorn cup, collude with disaster. On the edge of the story lies the part that refused to be fully spoken aloud during the trial. A stack of sealed envelopes kept in the sheriff's filings, labeled in a hand that looked ordinary. Other theaters, Fayetteville. The existence of the files suggests investigators suspected more than one theater, more than one van, more than one person who might have used cinematic crowds as cover. The envelopes had never been opened in public. Some said they contained dead leads. Others whispered of names crossed out, of evidence that frightened investigators into silence. Here is where we end, for now. The arrest put a man in a cell and gave a mother a verdict. It did not, and could not, return child. It did not erase the 2 decades of what-ifs or the way neighbors paused mid-sentence before mentioning Ethan's name. It did not completely explain a line in a young man's testimony or the presence of a blue van documented in a gas station's grainy feed. It did not answer who mailed the barrette or why, months after the conviction. An intern in the cold case unit found a file marked in pencil. Watch this number, 615. It referred to an unlisted phone number that had pinged near the theater on the day of Lily's abduction and then, curiously, had not been active again. The intern forwarded the info with a trembling hand. Detectives opened the file. They traced the number to a prepaid cell that had been bought at a convenience store that no longer existed. The clerk who sold the cell remembered a tall man with calloused hands, but his memory faltered on the important question of his face. There are in our towns thin threads that tie one mystery to another. The arrest of a man who smelled of motor oil and kindness answered question, but did not stop the threads from pulling. In basements and drawers, in county records, and the backs of old notebooks, there may be more tickets waiting to be clipped. The final page or pages have not yet been turned. If you think this story ends with the slam of the gavel, you're not alone. Fayetteville wanted one clean, final bow. But memory resists clean bows. There are always more questions. Always someone who remembers what they shouldn't. Always a small object in a box that insists the past isn't finished. Lily's face sits in a family album and on a brass bench and in the quiet of a mother's voice. Justice walked through a courtroom and left the town changed. The arrest did not free them from the ache. It only made the ache visible, like a scar you can trace with your fingers and still feel the heat under the skin. And the cliffhanger, the thing that keeps this story breathing, is simple. In the sheriff's cold case drawer behind the envelopes and the barrette, there is an unsigned notebook labeled names to check. The last name on the list is smudged, as if written in haste. Detectives have not yet agreed to open that final page publicly, but the pencil marks remain, a small promise that there are still paths to walk, witnesses to coax out, and perhaps somewhere answers that have been waiting all along for someone brave enough to follow the sound of a child's laugh into the dark. For now, Maya keeps one light burning in her window. She says it's for Lily. Maybe it's for herself. Or maybe, like the town, she is waiting to see whether someday someone will turn that smudged name into a full sentence and let the rest of the story be told. They found the smudge first, a faint, hurried scrawl behind a brittle comma of graphite, and then everything that followed uncoiled like a rope pulled from a hidden box. The intern's email had been small, 615, pinged near theater. See attached. Detective Rachel Morrell read it at her desk under a strip light that hummed like a low promise. She was the new face in cold cases, the one who had arrived with clean shoes and a determination that sometimes rang like arrogance in town halls. But she also had steady hands, and she had learned early that the smallest detail, a phone ping, a thumbprint on a popcorn cup, a smudge number in a sheriff's notebook, could be the hinge that swung the world back open. Rachel took the file to the sheriff's unlocked cabinet where the envelopes lay like a prayerful order of ghosts. She slid one out and smelled dust and old paper. On the back of a sheet of Reeves's original notes, careful, tidy handwriting. The smudged word stared up at her. Reeves. Not in the crisp blue of official ink, but in pencil. Perhaps written quickly. Perhaps written later. Reeves. Carl Reeves, the detective who had been at the center of the original investigation. The man town elders praised at Christmas dinners for keeping things together. Reeves, who now taught latchkey boys how to tie a fishing knot. Rachel felt something like cold wind run through her. She had sat through Ethan Mercer's trial, had watched Maya Hudson steady herself while jurors leaned their verdict like a bench into grief. She believed in evidence, in science, and the slow, polite cruelty of the law. She believed less in narratives that ended neatly. She believed in questions. Reeves's name on that list was not the kind of coincidence that left a room without footprints. She called the intern back and asked for everything. Phone pings, convenience store receipts, any notation of prepaid cell sales. They found the purchase. A prepaid flip phone bought on June 13, 2003, the day before Lily vanished, from a convenience store 3 blocks from a theater. The clerk, an older man now with the same hollow smile, remembered selling it to a tall man who wore a denim jacket and smelled of grease. He had not sold many phones then. He remembered because he thought the man looked like a cop. Reeves had been a cop. Detective Reeves then had access. Reeves had been seen on scene within hours after Maya's scream. Reeves had walked the theater with a flashlight and the correct solemnity of a man who knows how to look at tragedy without letting it remake him. He had taken witness statements. He had called for canine teams. He had led the evening press conference with a softness practiced to contain the town's hysteria. He had been the face of the search. Rachel and her partner, Luis Ortega, went to Reeves's house with warrant and caution. He opened the door and let them in with the kind of politeness that comes when a man understands the rules of visitors. He had aged. The face that had once been photographed on newsprint was now paper-thin with routine, though his eyes were sharp and the hands under the cuffs of his cardigan carried a certain habit. They paused at the seams of something unseen, and then kept going. He welcomed them into a den full of trophies, little plaques, newspaper clippings about cases solved, a framed photograph of a boy in a Boy Scout uniform he'd pinned somewhere in the 70s. "I expected you, Detective Morrell," he said. The voice was even a river under ice. Rachel tried one thing first. She asked for his recollection. Where had he been that afternoon? The day of Lily's disappearance? Reeves gave a practiced answer. He'd been at the station, coordinating searches, tracking leads. He had spoken with Maya that night, had held the phone like a small, brittle thing. He had been on the job. He had performed. In short, exactly what the public had required of him. But the cold case files had teeth of their own. Rachel sat at Reeves's kitchen table, sifted through boxes stacked with decades of blue-lined reports, and in a drawer beneath plastic child safety pamphlets, she found something that made her throat constrict. A photograph slightly curled at the edges, folded once, so the creases made maps. She unfolded it with the reverence of someone handling delicate evidence. It was a candid, perhaps taken by a neighbor, grainy and slightly out of focus. In the image, a man stood at the side exit near the theater's dim light, a child in his arms. The man's face was at the edge of the blur, a profile more than a portrait. But the shape of the nose, the tilt of the jaw, the way the mouth flattened, it was unmistakable to Rachel because she'd studied Reeves's face in trial transcripts and coffee shop conversations. The mouth. She did not show the photo to Reeves. She did not yet need to. She placed it in an evidence envelope and kept her next steps cold and methodical. The sheriff's office had reams of Reeves's notes, but they had never been audited by an outsider. Reeves's handwriting was everywhere in those files. Circled names, underlined phrases, redactions. There were weird little notations that made Rachel's knuckles ache when she read them. Parking lot /Bluebin/3, 12 p.m. Then a cross out. And then another notation smaller in pencil, Marcus. Watch. Marcus. The name seemed to wobble like a loose tooth. Marcus Reeves, Carl's son, had been a shy teenager back in 2003 who worked part-time at the theater, sweeping up and running the projector when they needed a hand. Marcus had left town in 2006. There were stories, as always in places that hold their secrets in closet air, of him living somewhere else, of his mother's letters, and his father's quiet pride. Rachel called every contact who had known Marcus and eventually found him, or what passed for him, in a trailer park 6 counties away. He was 30 now, heavy in the face and quick to laugh, but not without flinches when the word police came up. He met Rachel in a small diner where the coffee was bitter enough to sting. He fidgeted with sugar packets, rubbed the back of his hand. When she mentioned Lily Hudson, his eyes turned to glass, a man looking out a dark window. "I did time in my head," he said, voice thick with the kind of memory that tastes like pennies. He had been 19 in 2003, he told her, still a boy's voice trying on manliness. He remembered the night there had been a projection problem, a lull before the afternoon crowd. He had been sweeping when a man in a hoodie had slipped into the theater, had scooped up a girl, and carried her out. He had let it happen, not because he was mean, he said, and not because he thought he couldn't say anything. Because the man had looked at him, not with anger, but with a kind of command, and had whispered not a word. Marcus had been scared and filled with a stupid, shameful hope that the man would put the child back. He told Rachel later, as if the words were bricks he had been stacking for years, that he had lied to the police at the time because he was fearful of the man in the hoodie. He was fearful of what this man could do if the wrong tongue wagged. Rachel listened, the way she'd learned to listen, without surprise, quietly, cataloging the rhythm of truth. Marcus's story fit, but his shame was not the same as guilt for murder. He told her he had seen the man put Lily into a van. He had not seen where the van went. When Rachel asked about the denim jacket and smelled of grease, Marcus's jaw tightened. "My dad wears denim," he said, as if the two clues were coins that had been dropped into the same fountain. "He fixes things. He likes to be useful. He taught me to fix projectors." She left the diner with more questions than answers, and a photograph gone like a ghost in her pocket. She paid the clerk who sold the prepaid phone to write down the exact description of the buyer again. "Denim jacket," she repeated until he nodded, until the man in his slow way said he remembered the buyer's hands, large, steady, like a man used to heavy things, and then he added unbidden, he looked like a man who fixed things in the dark. And then, as if the town were a machine finally given a crank, old records turned. A neighbor remembered a truck, one of those old municipal pickups with a scratched tailgate and a dented fender, parked near the theater in the afternoons for weeks. A box of Reeves's old office receipts turned up where a family had kept old tax documents, among them a gas station docket from June 14th that smelled of oil and coffee and the kind of normality that hid the extraordinary. The timestamp on the receipt matched the phone ping. 3:17 p.m. Reeves had say the receipts filled his tank, not at the station 3 towns over, but at the one by the theater. When Rachel confronted Reeves with the receipts, his face shifted imperceptibly. "You will find a way to pin anything on me," he said, not loud, but with the kind of soft certainty a man speaks when he believes he owns the truth of himself. "I did my duty. I did my job." "Did your job include buying a prepaid cell that pinged near the theater the day Lily vanished?" Rachel asked. "Did your job include being at the side exit with a child in your arms? Did your job include writing Marcus, watch, and then crossing out?" He stared at her. The denying look had an old flatness to it. Then, as if he had been pulled into a private flame, he began to speak, but not in the way she expected. He told her haltingly about a night that stretched before him like a film he had been both actor and audience in. He said he'd been at the theater that day, yes, but to test the exits, to check whether a certain door would jam in case of fire. He said he had held a lost child once, a neighbor's, a toddler who had wandered off during a community screening, and had learned then how fragile the small bodies were. He said he had been shaking that day, that he had seen the man, and he had been afraid because he had recognized him as someone who frightened Marcus. He said finally, "I did not take Lily." The words were small, but they were not empty. Rachel pinned him with the photograph. "We found this in your things," she said. Reeves's hands went to the photograph, the skin around his knuckles whitening. He did not take the envelope. "Someone put that there to frame me," he said. "You think I am some kind of animal? People in this town do not understand how painful it is to be accused." "Why did you cross out Marcus's name?" Rachel asked. "Why are there notes that point toward a blue van in a parking lot in your hand?" "There are notes on every case," he said. "I kept things to myself to protect witnesses. I did what I had to." And then a break so sharp the air in the room seemed to snap. Rachel thought she saw it. A flinch so quick it could be mistaken for the settling of an old man. It was a movement that hinted at a memory with teeth. Then he spoke into it, not to confess, but to confess something worse. "Marcus was fragile," Reeves said, the last word tasting like an apology. "He was not equipped for what might happen. I kept him safe." "Safe from what?" Rachel asked. "From the consequences," Reeves said. There it was. An admission not of action, but of protection. The kind of protection that, in some families, shelters monsters under the floorboards. Rachel left the house with Reeves's face hovering like a photograph in her mind. She did not yet have the final edge she needed. Not a confession, not a body, not a single incontrovertible piece of truth. But she had a pattern. Phone ping, gas receipt, Marcus's memory, Reeves's notes. She had a sense of motive, not the voracious lust of some stranger, but a quieter, institutional greed of preservation. Protect your own, hold the line. Let the town believe what it wants. She had the meaning of the pencil smudge now. A guiding finger left in haste by someone who had either intended to reveal or to remind. For weeks the case became a fever. Rachel and Luis dug into Reeves's past, combed through years-old personnel files, and found a curious, painful ledger. Donations Reeves had quietly made to families, school events he'd sponsored, sponsorships for Marcus's Little League. Reeves had been the town's scaffolding. His small acts of benevolence were, in important ways, the reason people had never suspected. He was trusted. Trust had been his currency. And yet, there were other things. Pages in Reeves's casebook where he had underlined a name and put an asterisk by it. Not Marcus, but Hudson follow-up. He had harbored the case like a slow-burning ember. There were notes about interviews that had been misfiled, and a torn page smoothed into an envelope like a bandage. There were also, troublingly, entries about covering for helpful volunteers, a category that sat uneasily beside witness statements. Each redaction read like a hand pressed over the mouth of a child. As Rachel followed the trail, small, vital pieces began to slide into place. Marcus had not been alone the day of the disappearance. There was, in the originally filed witness accounts, the mention of a familiar voice in the parking lot, an adult voice that sounded like a man in authority. Witnesses had dimmed under the weight of time, and some, in the early panic, had told themselves not to remember. But there were also the theater's old employment records, long since lost in a move, and a faded payroll stub that placed Marcus's wage under the name Sir Reeves as a signatory. He had been under his father's wing at the theater. It was a redundancy that made Rachel's stomach turn. Father and son, protector and protected. The kind of pairing that removes the line between secret and policy. She scoured Reeves's home again with a warrant now and found behind a false layer of insulation in the crawl space, a small metal box. Inside, children's drawings, a barrette like Lily's, a Polaroid of a little girl wearing the same faded barrette. Lily's smile caught in frozen light. And then, perfunctorily folded, a letter in Reeves's handwriting. Rachel read the letter in a corridor where fluorescent lights dripped the same indifferent glare as in his kitchen that day. The handwriting was Reeves's. Precise, careful. The loops of his letters like the measured footfalls of a man who habitually cleaned his conscience with small acts. The letter did not say, "I did it." It did not say, "I know where Lily is." It said in a narrow, appraising script, "I tried to keep what mattered safe. I saw what I couldn't bear, and I put my hand over my son's mouth because the world would have taken him. If Lily is dead, I am the first person who has to say I couldn't protect her. We trade one life for another in a town that believes its good intentions will shield it from truth." There was no signature at the bottom. There was instead a number, a phone number Reeves had used in 2003. The number connected to a voicemail box that had never been checked. Rachel played the message with a handshaking bow. A voice answered from the past, tremulous, as if echoing through a long canyon. "I saw her go with him," the voice said. "It was Carl. He put her in the car. He told me to stay away." The voice belonged to Doris Lane, a temp worker from a bookshop near the theater. The same woman who had confessed to scratching the van's undercarriage. She had never come forward publicly, until now. And in the hush of the voicemail her words were small and bright as flint. The scandal that had always been a rumor in hushed church basements now snapped open in the exacting light of recorded voice. Discovery made real is a violent thing. Confronted with the letter and the voicemail, Reeves did something the detectives did not anticipate. He called for the press. He wanted to speak publicly, he said, to clear his name. The town packed the courthouse steps in a way that felt raw and hungry, as if they wanted the sky to bear witness. Cameras beeped and the mayor answered with a stiffness. Reeves, who had been hero and then suspected, mounted the steps like a man returning to his pulpit. "I will say once," he told the crowd, "that I did not take Lily. I hid things to protect a child. That is all. I do not ask for your forgiveness. I only ask for your reason." He left it like that, the predictable mercy of a man asking the town to understand him. But solidarity with a respected figure was an elastic thing. Community loyalty stretched and then snapped as evidence piled. The metal box, the voicemail, Marcus's shaky testimony. They all tugged at the town sense of itself. Calls came into the sheriff's office. "You knew. How could you? Why did he get to be the man?" Then at dawn on a Sunday, Reeves took his life. It was the sort of heart-stopping small collapse that towns like Fayetteville do not rehearse. An afternoon patrol had found his car in an empty lot by the river. He had left a final note on the kitchen table. Again, in the handwriting everyone recognized. It did not confess in the way people had wanted, did not offer the neat, ghastly resolution of "I did this," or "I did not do this." It was an invocation, more than anything, and the directory of half-truths. "I took what I had to protect," it read. "I cannot bear this weight any longer. Marcus was never meant to be made into a man. He is ragged. He is my boy." The note's last line was a plea. "Forgive me." Shock is a peculiar thing. It comes first as numbness and then as a low, more poisonous heat of anger. The town had split into factions now. Those who mourned a man they had loved and those who demanded a deeper reckoning. But justice does not wait on grief. It demands bodies. Reeves's death left a hollow where questions nested like birds. It also left the detectives with more than a paper trail. They had permission at last to open drawers and boxes they had once hesitated to touch. Reeves had been a cop. In his absence, the town could see more clearly the gaps he'd left behind. The most consequential gap was that Reeves had not only protected his son, he had, in letters and forgotten files, sheltered other names. Old reports turned up redacted sections that, when exposed, revealed meetings with certain town leaders, pastors, school officials, a county judge who had once been Reeves's close friend. Many of the redactions were marked with the same penciled flourish: protect family / not public. The reach of that notion, of shielding private reputations at the expense of victims, began to spread through the quiet like rot under planks. Then Rachel found the map. It was not an elegant map, but child scrawl in the margin of a Reeves file. A simple square, a pond marked with an X, and the phrase "Old Well." She followed the coordinates to a property Reeves had owned years ago in the outer part of town, a place he had said he used for fishing with Marcus. It was a field with a collapsed stone wall half hidden under bramble. When county workers cleared the brush, they found a rusted lid, and beneath it a burial spot that had been hurriedly shoveled and then disguised: leaves, gravel, the kind of amateur concealment that tries to mimic the ordinary. They found bones. The forensic team worked with a deliberate mechanical sadness. Bones do not speak in the way living witnesses do. They enumerate time, provide proofs. The lab took weeks, which felt like a long, small era to the people watching the TV news. When the report came back, it contained 2 words that made the air in Fayetteville burn. The bones were consistent with a small child, and the DNA matched Lily Hudson. Maya Hudson sat with the report in her lap, as if it might burn. The years of not knowing had been a fraying, elastic thing. Knowing brought its own terrifying gravity. Rachel stood in the doorway of Maya's kitchen, like someone holding a lantern under her face. And for once there were no prosecutorial platitudes to offer. Only a small, fierce presence. "We found her," Rachel said. The radio in the corner played some indifferent country song about roads and home. Maya's face for a moment did what grief does when it faces facts. It flattened, then focused, then folded in ways that are private and terrible. "Now what?" she asked. Now, the town had to reckon with the shape of its failure. Reeves's protection had been of a particular tribal sort. His instinct to shelter family, to keep the community's fragile sense of good from being punctured by messy truth. In the calculus of human error, that instinct had become a living thing that swallowed another life. The court of public opinion had never been gentle, but law requires more than guilt-shaped rumor. Ethan Mercer's conviction remained, and Rachel had to decide what his role had truly been. Even as the community recoiled at Reeves's suicide and the discovered remains, new legal threads began to tangle. If Reeves had engineered the investigation to mislead, had planted suspicion or silenced witnesses, had protected Marcus and thus shielded a true criminal, then the criminality had worn the uniform of law. Forensic files were re-examined. A motion to reopen Ethan's case was filed. Civil suits began to bloom like bruises. The town courthouse became a second theater of grief. Marcus, when he heard that Lily had finally been found, folded in on himself like a small animal finally cornered. He had, it transpired, left town in 2006 not to escape suspicion, but because guilt had become an unendurable garment. He had written a long, rambling letter to his father some months before Reeves's death, a letter that read like a fever dream. He spoke of the man in the hoodie, of being told by a father to keep quiet because the man would hurt us if we spoke. He wrote about the van and the way it had left, and about a time his father came home with grass in his shoes and refused to say why. In the end, Marcus's letter asked for absolution he knew he did not deserve. He mailed it to a P.O. box, and it sat unopened for 19 years until the cold case unit found it in a box of Reeves's dispatches after the suicide. Marcus's account had the ring of tortured honesty. He said that he had been there. He had watched his father take Lily and put her in a hole. He used the word hole deliberately, as if to spare the detail, and he had helped not in violence, but in the common human way of not obstructing authority. He had knelt and covered dirt with his bare hands. He had been a terrified boy who later measured the weight of his silence in sleepless nights. He had then fled to make himself small and less visible. When investigators pressed Marcus, he told them in blunt, broken sentences that his father had said it would be better if Lily were somewhere quiet. He told me she wouldn't feel alone, Marcus said, the words turning slow. He was right, maybe. He told me to be brave. The truth fell like hammered glass. Maya Hudson's reaction was not a singular flash, but a slow, complete rewriting of herself. She attended Reeves's memorial with a face that gave nothing away, and later she stood in the patch of earth where the well had been and knelt down to the bones they had found. They buried Lily again, this time with witnesses and with the resolution to give her a marker that read her name aloud. Lily Hudson, born 1999, taken 2003. It was not enough. Nothing could be. But it was necessary. The town of Fayetteville, its church ladies, its council members, its children, found itself altered. Who had they entrusted their safety to? The question was like rust. It spread. Charity boards were dissolved, trust funds audited, church elders deposed. The local paper printed an editorial that read like a country admonition. Do not build gods out of your neighbors. Mothers stopped leaving strollers unlocked on porches. Fathers who had once waved across street corners now watched the faces of strangers more intently. The theater installed cameras on every exit and a volunteer patrol that manned the lot during matinees. There were community vigils, and then there were whispered accusations. People stopped inviting each other over. They stopped standing on porches that had become observation posts. But the worst of community horror is not that a man committed a crime. The worst is that a man who wore the badge, who had been the shield, had chosen the family's preservation over a child's life, and that many had looked away. It was the small social complicity that haunted the newly revealed facts. In town diners, women who once baked cakes for Reeves now muttered, "We thought we were protecting a brave man," until they, too, began to wonder whether their protection was actually a kind of endurance of violence. In the months that followed, legal scholars called the case a study in institutional failure. National news recorded the outlines. The detective who saved his son, the bones found in an old well, the long trail of lesser choices that had led to murder. The case became, horribly, a civics lesson in courses and conferences, a cautionary tale about the dangers of loyalty unsworn by justice. But it did not stop the most private haunting. The way Maya Hudson watched other children in town, the way she listened for small things, a giggle, a misplaced shoe, as if some small sense might be a map back to a life. She kept Lily's photograph in her pocket like contraband. She did not know how to be done with grief. She only moved through it like a person crossing a room they'd once shared with someone. And then, one late autumn evening, an envelope arrived on her doorstep. No return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper typewritten. Rachel had seen enough of these things to know when an anonymous note is more than a taunt. It is an offer of something else. The note read in cold spacing, "You buried your child twice. The town buried a man who wore a badge. The town is still a machine that eats the truth to keep itself honest looking. Watch the watchman." There was no signature. The paper smelled faintly of the river. Maya folded it and kept it like something warm that might burn. Rachel, who had handled the case like surgeon, found that the edges of her own certainties had softened into something else, a long, low dread. She thought of Reeves's neat handwriting in the metal box, of Marcus's scarred palms, of the voicemail and the gas receipt. She had closed an investigative loop that had been open for 19 years, but in its closure had revealed a larger wound. A town that could engineer silence in the name of protection. A human calculus that traded one kind of pain for another. One night, months later, as the snow began to thin and the first buds made small hopeful points on otherwise dead branches, Rachel sat at her desk and thumbed through the case folder one last time. At the bottom, a small scrap of Reeves's handwriting blinked in pencil. Other theaters, Fayetteville. Beneath it, as if written in a different hand with a kind of impatience, a short line, 615, the same number, a loop that circled back on itself. Rachel felt the old, electric chill, the possibility that even the coldest of cases hold colder ribs of secrets. that even the clearest of closures can be rearranged. She told herself, done what she could. She had found bones. She had found a man who could no longer answer questions. She had found a child, finally. The rest, the moral economy of a town and the faith it placed in those who lead, was not news to be placed in a file. It was a living thing to be tended. On the steps of the courthouse that spring, a mother pressed a small white candle into Rachel's hand, a ritual piece of light, and said nothing. People still paused when they passed Reeves's old hardware store, where the paint peeled like scales. A bench was dedicated in Lily's name near the park, where children ran with sticky hands. They said never again, with the brittle earnestness of town meetings and the soft redundancy of prayer. And yet on the last page of the file, the one Rachel kept folded into a drawer under the key that she alone possessed, there was a Polaroid she had not yet shown anyone. It was of a small concession stand, its lights on, the popcorn machine idling. In the corner of the photo, a figure stood, half-shadowed, a hand resting on a child's shoulder. It looked almost like any other photo of any town's afternoon, except the reflection in the glass behind them caught, in a sliver, the hood of a sweatshirt and the face of a man in profile. It was not Reeves. It was, in the margin of the photo, a faint scribble in pencil that Rachel had not noticed until that night. Watch the watchers. There are certain endings that offer neither solace nor retribution. They offer instead a quiet, corrosive knowledge, that a community might discover its truth, and that truth might be worse than its silence. The town of Fayetteville learned this the hard way. They had buried a child, and when they found her again, she returned as proof of systemic betrayal. The arrest of a man years later had opened the wound. The suicide of a respected officer had turned the wound inward, so that everyone felt the pain. In the last lines of the county's report, the forensic pathologist wrote clinically about the time of death, about the survival interval, about the improbable and malign gap between what had been known and what had been hidden. He wrote, as doctors do, to cement things in neutral language. The victim died within days of abduction. Maya read the report as one might read a ledger balance. She knew the arithmetic of tragic endings intimately now. The knowledge did not console. It did not return a child. It did not fix the town or the small, complicated, culpable hearts in it. And yet the most chilling thing was not the discovery of the bones. The most chilling thing the residents would whisper in years afterward was the envelope Rachel had once found in Reeves's crawlspace. The letter with the number and the voicemail that said, "I saw her go with him." It was Carl. Because even after bones are found and courts adjourn, towns do not easily unlearn the lesson. Those with badges and applause can bury a child's life beneath a story of protection. They can fold a small human existence into an act called saving the family. In Fayetteville, years after Lily Hudson was given rest, mothers still checked pockets at theaters. Fathers still learned to read the faces of men who looked like they belonged. The town installed more lights and more locks, and they still gathered for vigils. People said never again, with clean mouths and unsteady hearts. But the memory, the shiver at the thought that someone close to the investigation had known more and chosen otherwise, lived in the small civic acts of suspicion that replaced the town's lost innocence. On a cold evening when the sky was a flat sheet of pewter, in the house that had once been Reeves's and later sold at auction, a teenager found an old Polaroid tucked in a loose floorboard. A practice, he would later say, in the casual way people archive oddities, was for good luck. He flipped the photo over and read the hastily scrawled words on the back, written in pencil. If you find this, know that we tried to hide a wrong and thought we had reason to do so. The word "we" was underlined twice. The teenager grew pale. He handed the photograph to his mother, who lived in the house now, and she placed it in the fireplace briefly, as one does with things that cannot be held in conversation. The photo charred in the small flames, and even in that moment, the ash smelled like unshriven confession. The last line of this story is not a neat cinematic reveal, but a lingering note you cannot quite forget. A community forced to rebuild its trust discovers, with a haunted slow clarity, that its moral architecture had been built not only with good men and good deeds, but also with silences. They learned that in the name of protecting the family, they had made sacrifices, the greatest of which was the life of a 4-year-old girl named Lily Hudson. And they learned too late that a man's badge does not make him immune to the dark, nor does a town's gratitude excuse the soft complicity of keeping secrets. Fayetteville would never look the same under daylight. The porch lights were always on now. Every time a child walked by the old theater, the adults around them felt a small, involuntary tightening in their chests, as if memory were muscle and caution its shadow. And on some nights, when the wind came right and the trees made the streets sound lonely, people swore they could hear a whisper, not a voice, but the sound of community's conscience shivering, asking in a voice that was thin but very human, "What else did we miss?" Before you go, make sure to hit subscribe, tap like, and turn on notifications. That way you'll never miss the next mystery cold case we uncover together. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I appreciate every single one of you for supporting this journey.